I can't explain why I keep coming back to this corner of the city, to this tired little bookstore sandwiched between the coffee shop and the laundromat. Maybe it's the smell of old paper, or maybe it's because she's here. Miss Harper, the woman who should have intimidated me on sight, but instead makes me feel like I'm walking on a floor of invisible tension. She's mid-40s, sharp-angled in the way she carries herself, every movement precise, deliberate, but not in a showy way. She's the kind of woman who knows exactly who she is, and yet somehow, when she glances at me, there's a flicker, almost invisible, like she's considering whether I belong in her orbit. I first noticed her when I came in to pick up a book I didn't really need. She was at the counter, running a finger along the spine of a dog-eared novel, lips pursed, and hair pulled into that effortless twist that somehow made her look both busy and untouchable at once. She didn't smile at first, but there was something gentle in the way she tilted her head, listening, really listening, when I mumbled something half-intelligible about the book's author. "I think you'd like it," she said softly, not looking at me yet, but I swear I felt it in her tone, in the slight upturn at the corner of her lips. I nodded like an idiot, fumbling with the wallet in my pocket. Then she handed it to me. Her fingers brushed mine. It was nothing, really, but the brush lingered in my mind far longer than it should have. And when our eyes met, even briefly, there was that pause, long enough that I wondered if I'd imagined it. That split second where her gaze seemed to weigh me, test me, and then quietly move on. She moved back to shelving books, and I hovered near the doorway, suddenly aware of the sound of my own breathing, the scrape of my sneakers against the worn floor. My mind refused to be still. Why did her voice, so calm, so measured, echo in my head after just a sentence? Why did her small act of handing me a book feel like a tiny lifeline? There was a man at the register behind me, older, rumpled, tapping impatiently on the counter. But I couldn't focus on him. All I could focus on was the way Miss Harper's hand lingered just a second too long on the spine of a novel, as though she were smoothing some invisible crease in the air, or maybe in my chest. I left the store half an hour later with the book tucked under my arm, pretending like I hadn't just replayed that small moment a dozen times in my mind. I didn't speak a word to her on my way out, didn't need to, but I caught her eye once, just long enough to feel the spark, subtle and dangerous, of something unspoken. And now, walking home, I can't stop thinking about it. The way her hand touched mine, the faint, almost imperceptible smile, the way her voice, calm and quiet, still lives in my silence, echoing whenever I close my eyes. I know I shouldn't be thinking about her like this. She's so far out of reach. But something tells me that one day, that unspoken spark might be the thing that changes everything. I didn't plan on seeing her again so soon, but life has a cruel sense of timing. The bookstore had a delivery to sort, and I'd somehow been roped into helping. Boxes stacked too high, labels that refused to stay straight, and the faint smell of paper glue hanging in the air. She was crouched behind a cart, trying to wedge a stack of books in place. "Careful," she said without looking up. Her voice was clipped, but it softened when she added, almost under her breath, "They're old editions. Fragile." I crouched down beside her. My fingers brushed against hers while adjusting a book, and for a moment, her hand froze. Just a twitch, but enough. I caught the faintest tightening at her jaw. She didn't look at me, kept her eyes fixed on the task. "You do this often?" I asked, trying to fill the silence. "More than I care to admit," she murmured. Her shoulders tensed, then relaxed a fraction. A sigh slipped past her lips, quiet but real. I noticed the way her hair had loosened slightly from its twist, soft strands falling across her forehead. She blinked rapidly, almost like she was fighting some internal weight. I wanted to ask what was wrong, but there was a line I didn't dare cross. Instead, I focused on the small details, the faint tremor in her fingers as she lifted a heavier box, the subtle crease near her eyes when she blinked, the way she exhaled with a mixture of exhaustion and something I couldn't name. "You okay?" I asked again, softer this time. Her eyes flicked to mine, just long enough for me to see the faint shadows under them. She nodded quickly, almost too quickly, and forced a smile. "Yeah, fine. Just tired." I believed her, But part of me also felt the lie. Something in her posture, slightly hunched, a foot shifting restlessly, spoke louder than her words. I caught myself staring longer than I should, memorizing the shape of her hands, the way her knuckles whitened when she gripped a box. Then she laughed, abruptly, at something I hadn't even noticed. It was short, a little breathy, and it made the air between us tremble, like we'd just brushed against something fragile. I smiled without realizing it, caught by the unguarded moment, and she glanced at me, a flicker of awareness passing across her face before she looked away again. The work continued in quiet rhythm, our movements occasionally brushing, occasionally meeting in shared effort. I felt a strange gravity, a pull toward her, both dangerous and irresistible. My chest tightened with the awareness that every gesture, every glance, held weight we weren't ready to acknowledge. Finally, she reached for a book and paused, fingers hovering just above the cover. I watched her hand tremble slightly. Then she let out a soft breath and placed it down carefully. Her eyes met mine for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I swear I caught a flicker of something unspoken, hesitation, maybe, or a silent question she wouldn't voice. And in that suspended moment, just before she turned back to the card, I felt it, the gentle pull of forbidden energy between us, quiet and steady, impossible to ignore. I left that evening with the echo of her laugh and the memory of that glance lodged firmly in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about the weight of her silence, the softness in her eyes, and the way her hand had trembled, fragile, human, unreachable. The rain started without warning, tapping against the big front window like it had a personal vendetta against the quiet. We were still at the bookstore, rearranging some overdue returns, and I could feel the room shrink around us. She moved with the same precise rhythm as always, but there was a softness tonight, an almost imperceptible slack in her shoulders, a flicker in her eyes when she glanced at me. I carried a stack of books toward her, and for a brief second, our hands brushed. Not just the fingers, the whole weight of our bodies seemed to acknowledge each other. She didn't pull away, not immediately, and I felt a jolt, a surge of something dangerous. My chest tightened, and I caught myself holding my breath, hoping she wouldn't notice. "You think they'll ever sort themselves?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. She tilted her head, that faint smirk threatening at the corner of her lips. "Not without help. Yours or mine, I suppose." Her gaze lingered a second too long. I wanted to say something, confess, maybe, or just tell her how alive the room felt when she was near, but the words lodged in my throat. I told myself it wasn't the time, it wasn't right. Yet every tiny brush of her hand against mine sent a ripple through me I couldn't contain. Then her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket with a quick sigh, and the screen showed a name I didn't recognize. She frowned, hesitated, then pressed ignore. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she slipped the phone back into her pocket, and I noticed the small, almost imperceptible tremor in her fingers. I wanted to ask if she was okay, but I stayed silent. The rain intensified, streaking down the glass in long lines, and the light from the street lamp outside pooled across her face in gold and shadow. I wanted to reach out, to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, to tell her she didn't have to carry every little weight alone. But the room seemed to shrink further, every inch between us both inviting and forbidding. We moved closer to stack a particularly tall pile of books, and our shoulders brushed. My heart pounded, loud enough that I was certain she could hear it. I caught the faint scent of her perfume, something warm and comforting, and I wanted to say it. The thing I wasn't supposed to say. But the moment didn't belong to either of us. A sudden clatter from the back room made her flinch, snapping her attention away, and I exhaled slowly, pretending to adjust a book. She didn't look back at me. I stayed just a second too long, hands frozen on the pile of books, feeling the nearness that was both impossible and magnetic. I could have leaned closer, could have let a word slip, could have let her see what I was trying not to show, but I didn't. Instead, I watched her straighten, shoulders back, mask of control back in place. My chest ached with the weight of unspoken words, and I realized that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one building between us. And yet, As we worked side by side in silence, that brief brush, that tiny shared moment, lingered, charged, dangerous, and tantalizingly incomplete. We stayed late that night, long after the rain had stopped and the street outside had emptied into a kind of dark hush. The bookstore smelled of wet paper and dust, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead. She was perched on a ladder, reaching for a book on the top shelf, and I was kneeling nearby, stacking returned copies, pretending my hands were busy. Then she slid down and stood in the middle of the aisle, hands resting lightly on her hips. I felt a flicker of tension in her shoulders, a weight that had nothing to do with books. I wanted to ask, but I knew the words wouldn't come out right. She finally broke the quiet. "Why are we like this?" Her voice was soft, uneven, like she was testing it first in her mouth before sending it out. My head jerked up. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already knew. Her gaze held mine, sharp and unflinching, and I felt the air thicken. "I mean this. Us. Standing here pretending nothing's happening when it feels like everything is." I swallowed hard, and my throat felt tight. I wanted to reach for her, to explain, or maybe to confess, but I didn't. Instead, I just stood there, watching the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides, how her eyes flicked briefly to the floor before returning to mine. I began, then stopped. Words were useless here. They never captured the weight of the pause between us, the electricity that hung like a storm cloud, waiting to break. She exhaled, a soft, shaky breath, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. "I don't know if this is right, or if it's safe, or if we're just—" Her words faltered, and she shook her head, frustrated, raw, and achingly human. The silence stretched between us, dense and impossible to ignore. I wanted to say something, anything, but all I could do was notice. The way her collarbone caught the light, the subtle slump in her stance, the way her eyes seemed almost bigger than her face. I realized then that nothing could stay normal. Nothing could be casual anymore. Every glance, every pause, every brush of her hand held too much weight to ignore. I don't know what I'm doing either," I whispered finally, almost to myself. The sound of my own confession startled me, and she flinched, like hearing it out loud made it real. Her lips parted, then closed. She glanced away, then back at me. The room held its breath with us, every ticking second loud and sharp. "Finally," she said, almost breaking, "I think. I'm scared." And in that silence that followed, I felt something fracture inside me, something I couldn't fix. The vulnerability between us was raw and exposed, and I realized, with sudden clarity, that whatever this was, it was bigger than a brush of hands, bigger than a fleeting glance, and maybe infinitely more complicated than either of us could handle. I wanted to speak, to offer reassurance, but all I could manage was to watch her shoulders shake slightly, caught in a moment she didn't have words for. And in the quiet of that bookstore, under the dim hum of the lights, I knew, if she let herself fall, even a little, I would follow. But she didn't fall. Not yet. It was a slow afternoon. The sunlight had that late winter gold, cutting through the dust motes like tiny stars suspended in the air. We were reorganizing a shelf near the back corner, where the older books leaned against each other, spines worn thin. She paused mid-reach, fingers brushing the edge of a photograph tucked between two volumes. I noticed the way her hand trembled slightly, and I stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. "What is it?" I asked softly. She didn't answer at first. Her eyes were fixed on the photo, distant. Finally, she sighed and let herself sink onto the floor, back against the shelf. "It's him," she said, voice low. "My ex years ago. I thought I'd moved on. I thought I'd forgotten." I crouched down beside her, careful, hesitant. "You haven't." Her laugh was bitter, short, without humor. "I've buried him mostly. But sometimes," she swallowed, fingers tightening around the photograph. "Sometimes it all comes back. That voice, that laugh, the way he made me feel, alive and terrified at the same time. I thought I'd never let anyone close again." I watched her, silent, noticing every nuance. The slight slump of her shoulders, the faint tremor in her hands, the way her eyes glistened just enough to betray the story she wasn't fully telling. I wanted to say something that mattered, something to make the weight on her chest lighter, but instead I offered a memory. I knew someone once, a friend she carried a loss the same way. Silent, quiet. And one day, she let someone small into the space, and it didn't fix everything, but it shifted things. She looked at me, not fully understanding, and a half-smile tugged at her lips. Shifted things. I shrugged, uneasy. Just made it bearable, I guess. Not gone, not fixed, but something less heavy. She nodded slowly, tucking the photograph back between the books with care. I forgot how sharp memories can be, she whispered. Her gaze lingered on the shelf, distant, fragile. Then she looked at me, really looked, and for the first time I saw the bare, unguarded edge of her. Vulnerable, yes, but not broken. We stayed there a while, side by side, neither saying much, just letting the silence stretch. And then, from her jacket pocket, a voicemail beeped on her phone. She hesitated, thumb hovering, and finally pressed play. The voice on the recording was unmistakable, someone from her past, reaching out, a quiet apology. She listened, lips pressed together, eyes widening slightly with a tremor that ran all the way down her arms. I could only watch, feeling the subtle quake in the air, that fragile, seismic shift in her world and in ours. Finally, she set the phone down, eyes meeting mine, softer now. I didn't expect that, she whispered. And even though the words were small, quiet, it felt like the ground had moved. A little, just enough. And in that moment, I realized that the fragile walls she'd built weren't indestructible. Not for me. Not entirely. We were alone that evening. The bookstore closed, the golden light from the street lamps spilling across the floor in long rectangles. The air smelled faintly of paper, glue, and the rain that had returned earlier, soft and insistent against the windows. She was perched on a low stool, knees pulled close, sorting through a stack of returned books. I sat across from her, leaning against a shelf, just watching. There was no grand declaration, no sudden confession, just the quiet acknowledgement that had been building for weeks, months, maybe, between us. A shared glance, a brush of fingers over a book spine, the soft exhale when our hands had almost touched but didn't. I don't think we can keep pretending this isn't happening, she said softly, almost to herself, and I felt the truth in her words. Not romantic yet, not perfect, but real, unequivocally real. I nodded, words unnecessary. I wanted to tell her everything, to make sense of the pull I'd felt since the first day I saw her smile at the counter, but there was no need. She understood, in that quiet, wordless way, the way we often communicate without speaking at all. She leaned back, and her shoulder brushed mine, just slightly, but the contact was enough. Enough to send a shiver through my chest and hold it there. I caught her eyes, lingering on the faint curve of her lips, the way the light softened her features, and I realized that the space between us had collapsed into something unavoidable, something inevitable. I shifted slightly, careful, deliberate, and our hands brushed, fingers touching lightly over a book. Neither of us pulled away. Not immediately. The touch was small, almost incidental, yet it held everything. The trust, the hesitation, the quiet surrender that had been building all along. She exhaled, letting her hand rest there for just a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I did the same. It wasn't a declaration of love, but it was a promise, a recognition. A gentle decision to lean into the gravity that had drawn us together from the beginning. For a while, we just stayed like that. Fingers brushing, shoulders close, eyes occasionally meeting, but mostly lost in the quiet hum of the bookstore. No grand gestures, no speeches, just two people acknowledging the inevitability of each other, the slow burn finally finding its natural, steady rhythm. And then, almost imperceptibly, she leaned her forehead against mine, just for a second. Warm, soft, and fragile. I felt the weight of everything we hadn't said settle into that small, perfect contact. Time seemed to fold around us, quiet and infinite, and I realized that this unspoken, mutual understanding, was enough. When she pulled back, we didn't speak. Words would only cheapen the moment. I watched her smile faintly, a little unsure, a little brave, and I smiled back. That was it. No promises, no labels, just a shared space, a shared breath, a shared quiet that said everything that needed saying. And in that silence, I finally felt at home. I still remember that first day clearly, the way her voice floated across the bookstore, soft but deliberate, and the way my chest tightened when our hands brushed over a book spine. Back then, I didn't understand what was happening between us. Didn't even know how to name the pull that felt at once impossible and inevitable. Now, months later, I can see it in perspective. We've moved slowly, cautiously, learning the rhythm of each other, the invisible cues that mean more than words ever could. She's still confident, still sharp, but there's a softness now that wasn't there before, a trust earned and given in small, quiet gestures. And me? I've learned to be patient, to read the spaces between her words, to understand that love isn't always loud or immediate. Some nights we sit in silence in the corner of the bookstore, her knees tucked close, me leaning beside her, the muted hum of the city outside pressing in gently. There are no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations, just the weightless, steady presence of someone who has chosen you despite everything. And that is more than enough. We've seen the past ghosts surface, memories of old heartbreak, of missed chances, and we've learned to let them rest without letting them define us. I've seen her laugh more freely, feel her shoulders relax in a way that makes the room feel warmer, lighter. And I've stopped pretending that my heart can ever be casual around her. It's full, entirely, in ways I didn't think possible. It's strange, the way love sneaks up on you, grows in the cracks of ordinary life. It doesn't always roar. It whispers, lingers, unfolds slowly until one day you realize it's not just a spark, but a quiet, steady flame that refuses to die. We've learned that it doesn't need perfection. It doesn't need fireworks. It only needs presence, patience, and the courage to lean into what's real. And sometimes, when the store is empty and the lights are dim, we catch each other's gaze and let a small smile do what words never could. Fingers brushing over a book, a shoulder leaning just slightly closer. Tiny, fragile moments that carry a lifetime. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. Maybe the world will intrude. Maybe it won't. But right here, right now, I know this. The quiet, steady pull that began months ago has grown into something enduring, something human and flawed and beautiful, something that makes ordinary moments feel monumental. So if you've ever felt that unspoken pull, that impossible gravity towards someone you shouldn't, or think you shouldn't, remember this. The slow burn isn't a weakness. It's proof that real connection is built in the pauses, the glances, the silences that speak louder than words. And maybe, just maybe, the best love is the one that doesn't announce itself. The one that grows quietly, steadily, until you finally realize you're home. Have you ever felt a connection like that? One that lingers long after the moment passes?